My name is Steve Antonuccio, and this is my program on the Amache Internment Camp in Granada, Colorado, which was open for 3 years, only 3 years, August 27th, 1942 to October 15th, 1945. Now, I've given this presentation to several local history groups in Colorado Springs, to the Pikes Peak Posse, to the El Paso County Pioneers Association, and to the Pillar Institute. So it's a subject I've researched for a lot of reasons. But to give you a little bit an idea on my background, is I started out as a librarian. I worked for 30 years in public and academic libraries, and I worked for 20 years for the Pikes Peak Library District, producing video documentaries on local history. We had our own cable channel. We called it the Library Channel. And we did a lot of interviews with different people in the area, produced video portraits, and did extensive documentaries on the history of Colorado Springs. I've written about my experiences being a librarian in a book called There's No Such Thing as a Typical Librarian, which you can purchase on Amazon, either in book form or in audiobook form as well. It's also on Audible. But I did not have a chapter on Amache. My interest in Amache came after I retired, and I kind of dug deep into the history. I started with several things. First, with my own family history. My grandfather had a farm in Mountain View, and their neighbors and best friends were the Nakamura family. My grandfather grew tomatoes and string beans, and the Nakamuras had a raspberry farm that they had right next to my grandparents. They're actually on the same property owned by somebody else, but they were both my grandfather and the Nakamuras leased that particular land. And it's a fascinating story. Her family got together and they did a book. They published a book called My First 100 Years, the memoirs of Nellie Nakamura. She actually lived 107 years in the Bay Area, with the exception of the time she spent in the internment camps in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. But my mother would tell me stories about when this was occurring and how horrible it was. And these were close friends to their family. And she could remember them coming over to the house and crying after Pearl Harbor, knowing that things were going to get pretty bad for Japanese Americans. And they did. Nellie had a young boy at the time named Kenny, who I think was 7 years old. He was my Uncle Gene's best friend. And he ended up dying of meningitis at the Heart Mountain camp, which was horrible for the family to put up with. It probably would have not happened had they not been interned in a camp where the conditions weren't very good. But my mother would tell me stories. She said she remembered when they had just a few weeks to pack everything and go and leave their homes. And the scavengers were coming by trying to buy things penny on a dollar, all their possessions. And instead of doing that, a lot of the Japanese American farmers had a bonfire and they burned their personal possessions rather than selling it cheap. So it's a very difficult time, but they survived. And my grandfather, to his credit, they had a little house on their property. It was almost like a trailer. They built it themselves. It was a tiny little home. And my grandfather made sure that when they came back to the Bay Area, they were able to move back into their home. And they picked up right from where they left off and were able to have a successful life with their kids. But my interest in Amache began when I read this article in the Denver Post. This is dated 2003. It was on the 60th anniversary of this football game that occurred on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1943, in the internment camp against Holly High School, which was a local high school made up of Caucasian players. They're farm boys. They're much larger than the Amache team. Maybe they outweighed them 25 pounds a player. They even had a 200-pound fullback. And the article was great because they interviewed a lot of people who played in that game, and that included Roy Romer, the future governor of Colorado. He was a center at the time for the Holly team, and they were undefeated. They're going to the state playoffs, and they needed a tune-up game. There was a gap between the time they played their last game and when they were going to go in the playoffs. And so they called the Amache coach and asked if they could play a game. And the Amache coach said, sure, we'd be happy to do that, but we can't play at your place because this is a prison. None of my players can leave. And so they decided to have the game inside Amache on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1943. Certainly an appropriate day to have it. And it was a defensive battle. At halftime, it was 0-0, which was remarkable because the Holly team was so much better physically and larger physically than the Amache team. But the Amache players had a huge chip on their shoulder. They wanted to prove they were just as good as any American kids. And so they were able to score. Amache was able to score in the third quarter. And incredibly, they held out this 200-pound fullback, and it was a real defensive struggle. And they ended up winning the game 7-0. And I thought this would be a great movie. This was played in front of the people of Amache. They had 2,000 people watching the game. They didn't have bleachers. They were standing around the field. And it was really a point of inspiration for everyone that lived there. And eventually, many of them joined the military and fought with the famous 442, the Go for Broke regiment that was considered the most decorated regiment of any American forces during World War II for its size. But anyway, I saw this. This would make a great movie. I put it off for 20 years, and then I decided I'll write a screenplay, and I called it Fourth and Going Home, and I finished it around 2020. And it's done very well in contests, but it got my interest in Amache. And when I wrote the screenplay, I had to research it, and I learned a lot about Amache and produced a PowerPoint program. But again, the Japanese American players, they were American citizens, and they were like any American kids. They loved American sports. They loved football. They loved baseball. They loved basketball. And it gave them a way to forget about the circumstances of being away from their home. And so many of them participated in sports. This is a football game. This is not at Amache. This is another internment camp. But it shows that how seriously they took it. These are intramural games that they were playing. And the fans that were watching the games, and they full pads. They played with full pads. They were able to acquire uniforms. A lot of the college football teams had discontinued football for the time being during the war, and they were able to purchase some uniforms. And all of the internment camps had football teams. But I want to give you a little bit of background on Amache. There were 7,500 Japanese Americans that lived in Amache at the height of the camp, making it the 10th largest city in Colorado. They're all from California. Most of the Japanese that were interned were from California. Most of them were farmers. There were 120,000 Japanese Americans who lived in the internment camp in the USA for the time period of the war. There were some in Hawaii that were not sent to internment camps, but for the most part, the majority of Japanese Americans lived in internment camps. Now, it was made up of Japanese citizens as well. They had Isai, which is those citizens that were born in Japan, many of them the grandparents and parents who immigrated to the United States. There were laws that they called the Asian exclusion laws, so they could not become American citizens. They wanted to, but they weren't allowed to become American citizens. But their children and grandchildren, by virtue of being born in the United States, were United States citizens. So about 2/3 of them in the internment camps were United States citizens born in the United States, and about 1/3 were Japanese citizens that were born in Japan. Amache is not a Japanese name. It was named after Amache POWs, who was a Cheyenne princess who married a Caucasian man, John Wesley POWs. It was an arranged marriage. Her husband saw her dancing at her Cheyenne village, and he asked her father, who was a Cheyenne chief, if he could marry her daughter. And he agreed. It was an arranged marriage, very successful marriage. They had 9 children. They had a successful business, a cattle ranch with 15,000 heads of cattle. She assimilated to the white culture. She learned English, but she kept her Cheyenne traditions as well. And of course, there was a famous game that happened, a high school football game that happened between Holly High School and Amache High inside the internment camp behind barbed wires and guard towers on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1943. Now, Japanese Americans, when the war started, when Pearl Harbor happened, many of them went down to the recruiting offices, just like other American young men, and they were not allowed to join the military. And the reason why, they just had an exclusion for Japanese Americans. I guess they were afraid of spies. If you were Japanese American and already in the military, you could stay. But if you wanted to join, you were not allowed to until a year later, January 1943, they finally agreed to let Japanese Americans join because they needed the people in the military. It was a difficult time back then. And so 1,000 Amache men and women, you had to be an American citizen, joined the United States military, and 31 former Amache residents were killed in action in Europe. And there's a memorial now at the Amache Historic Site, and I'll show you photos of that later. But it was a tough deal. It was a tough deal for all families, and those who wanted to prove their loyalty couldn't do it until till the U.S. military allowed them to join. And then, of course, the 442 was a remarkable group of soldiers who proved that they were loyal to the United States and pretty much gave their lives willingly, hoping that if they did, that their parents would be released from their prison in the internment camps across the United States. It's interesting because Colorado Governor Ralph Carr spoke out against the internment of Japanese Americans at the time, and it cost him his political career. Ralph Carr was a country lawyer. He was born in Cripple Creek. His father was a miner, and he became an attorney. He went to the University of Colorado, became an attorney. He moved to southern Colorado, where he learned to speak Spanish and practice law in southern Colorado, and then eventually got into politics and was elected governor of Colorado. Now, this was in 1939, before Pearl Harbor. And at the time, he had a phone number that he didn't enlist. Many politicians enlisted their phone numbers because they knew people would call them up. And he said, no, I'm not going to enlist my phone number. I want people to be able to call me if they're citizens of Colorado and talk to me if they have a question or if they need help. So when he became outspoken about the internment of Japanese Americans, he said that these are American citizens and you can't arrest American citizens without due process. You can't give them a chance to prove their innocence. And that, of course, wasn't the case. He became very controversial, and then he would get 9-10 calls a night, people calling him a Jap lover and cursing him out. And if they were patient enough to listen to him, he would explain why this was wrong, why if you're Italian, if you're German, if you're Irish, to imprison people, American citizens, based on the race is against the Constitution. Now, this is Amache Powers. She was a great woman. She's in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame now. She was a mother of 9 children. She had a wonderful marriage with John Wesley Powers. They had a successful cattle ranch, and she was a businesswoman. They owned a herd of 15,000 cattle. So it took Amache and all their children and her husband to make the ranch successful. She was a Cheyenne princess whose father was murdered. He was a Cheyenne chief, and he was murdered during the Sand Creek Massacre. Now, when she was a successful businesswoman, she would go to Denver to sell her cattle. And she was at some Cattlemen's Association meeting, and someone came up to her with Colonel Shivington, and they didn't know the relationship because Colonel Shivington was involved in the Sand Creek Massacre. He said, Amache, I want you to meet someone. Have you ever met Colonel Shivington before? And she goes, no, I've never met him, but I know who he is. He is the man who murdered my father. So it was obviously it was an awkward moment, but she still kept her pride in her Cheyenne race, her Cheyenne traditions and community. Now, when Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, it was only a couple months later that FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which meant the internment of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans in internment camps across the country. So immediately they start building these camps, and they're coming out of depression. The United States is coming out of depression, so didn't take long for them to be able to hire people and to get things moving, but it just went at a rapid pace. And so they built the Amache camp for $4.2 million. The 550 buildings, they built it on 650 acres. And they did that in less than 3 months. They built the camp in 3 months. They acquired an additional 10,000 acres that were used for ranching and farming efforts. And because most of the Amache residents were farmers, had been farmers in California, they were really skilled at what they did. So they had a lot of pride. Again, they made lemonade out of lemons. And the farm was very successful. They were able to feed the 7,500 residents within a year. And they had extra food left over that they sold to Heart Mountain internment camp and other internment camps. But this is typical families getting off the train from California and getting on buses to go to Amache. You can see they're all very well dressed. The reason why is because they can only carry one suitcase. So their best clothing, their Sunday dresses and clothing, they had to wear. They didn't want to get it wrinkled, and then everything that they had left, the underwear and whatever else they might have, they could only take in one suitcase. And for the most part, they were very compliant. There were several lawsuits, which there should be, against interning American citizens that went on, but they complied with what the United States had requested. They were waiting for their chance to prove they were loyal American citizens. And in January 1943, when they were able to join the military, 1,000 residents of Amache, probably out of 5,000 that were eligible to join the military, maybe less than that, it might have been 4,000, joined the military, both men and women. And this is the internment camp right after it was built. You can see there's no greenage, there's no trees, there's no flowers, nothing. They really did take advantage, and they turned it around into a very green place. They grew flowers. They made it very livable. They built parks. They built playgrounds for their kids. And again, they made lemonade out of lemons. They took advantage of this disappointing event, and they made it as good as they possibly could. Now, if you've ever visited a prison, you know that prisoners run prisons, and I visited every prison in Colorado because I did a documentary on the history of the Colorado Department of Corrections. But the prisoners do everything. They do the maintenance, they do the cooking, they run the kitchens, everything that needs to be done in a prison, with the exception of guarding it. That's done by other people. The same thing with Amache. The residents took care of everything. They had a movie theater. They ran the movie theater. They had a newspaper. They ran the newspaper. They had schools. They ran the schools. They had churches. They did everything except guard the Amache internment camp. That was left up to the Army. However, there was not a single escape from Amache. They could have escaped easily because the ranch was not surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. So those who worked on the ranch and the farm could easily have walked away. But they wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States. And where could they go? If they escaped, go back to California, because they were Japanese, they would stand out, and their families were in Amache. So they said, let's make the best of it. Hopefully at some point they'll close this place down and we can return home, which did happen at the end of 1944 when they started to close down Amache. Now, this is a typical family. These are probably Nisei, American citizens, the mother there with her 2 kids. They're like any other American children. They loved American sports, football, basketball, baseball, and they did the best they could under difficult circumstances. And again, the farmers, 80% of them were already farmers when they were in California. They either had their own farms at the time, or they were sharecroppers and sublet their farms, like my grandfather did. But they had the skills. It was a perfect set of skills for these people to work on the farm and work in the ranch. And they worked very hard workers, very successful before they came to Amache with their farms. And they took a lot of pride in doing things right. Again, they had to leave their money in the banks. They had to leave their farms and businesses. If they had a loan on their business, they couldn't work that business or farm to pay it off. So all these farms were taken over by the banks by virtue of them not being able to work them and make any money. So they lost everything. They really did lose everything by being sent to an internment camp. Now Amache is a National Historic Site, and it's in the middle of nowhere. I live in Pueblo, Colorado, and I live in the middle of nowhere. It's still a 3-hour drive to get to the Amache site in Granada, Colorado. Because of the effort of John Hopper, who was a teacher, and I'll show his picture here in just a little bit, it's been preserved. The Amache site, I went there on a day, it was a hot day. No one else was there, unfortunately, because the Amache site is not off of I-25 or I-70. It's not really a convenient place to go to visit. But they have preserved some of the buildings that were still there. This is an original guard tower, and it's there on the site. And I just walked around the site. I mean, there's no guided tour. You can go through it. A lot of the things are labeled, and there's stories that are told there, but you just walk around, and it's well worth it. It's well worth the visit. Now, here's John Hopper. This is the museum. They have the original location of Amache and the Amache site, and they also have a wonderful museum. John Hopper is a local educator and principal at Granada K-12 school. He is the one who created the Amache Museum. I think he taught history, and he suggested to his students, here we live by the ruins of this Amache site. I think he's been there for 30 years. Let's preserve it. Let's make it part of a history project, which they did. And even today, the museum is run and operated by the high school students that came through. And when I was there and they gave me a tour, these two wonderful girls that showed me the facility. They have an audio-visual room where they show films and other things that I'm going to show you a little bit later on. But John Hopper really is the one who gets credit for doing this wonderful thing. And this is the Amache Museum from outside. To give you an idea, Granada population is 445 people. It's a small, small town. There's not a single Japanese-American family that lives in Granada. The K-12 school has an enrollment of 210 students, so very small. But they've done a wonderful job of preserving the history. And it's an important part of the city's involvement. And if you go to Granada, go to a restaurant, spend some money in town. I think they would appreciate it. Now, this is President Roosevelt, FDR, who signed Executive Order 9066, February 19th, 1942, that led to the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans living in California. This is Republican Colorado Governor Ralph Carr. He became governor in 1939. He died in 1950. He's the one who took a heroic stance against the internment of Japanese Americans. Again, he said, you can't imprison American citizens. The Constitution does not allow it without due process, without giving them a chance to prove their loyalty to the United States. And that didn't occur. And he ran for state after he finished being governor in 1943. After the war, he did run for United States Senate. He lost the election, probably because people remembered his stance on the internment camps, and he died in 1950. Because of his heroic stance, in 1999, he was named Colorado Person of the 20th Century by the Denver Post. And that was well-deserved. He was probably the greatest person to live in Colorado in the 20th century. He did what was right. He spoke out about what was right, and he didn't curb or kneel down to those people because of the political ramifications. And the Japanese American community love him. They produced a little square, a Japanese square, and a sculpture dedicated to his memory. Now, this is another Republican politician that the Japanese Americans really admire. This is Republican President Ronald Reagan, who signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. He was governor of California, so he knew a lot of Japanese American families. He knew the story of what happened to them in the internment, and he felt that was unfair. So they had the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which included a public apology and reparations to Japanese Americans, $20,000 for each person who had to leave their home and were sent to a camp. And for many Japanese Americans, it was the time that they finally felt, all right, things are better. We were able to prove that what they did was wrong. We gave our lives for our country during the war. And now President Reagan has done this to help us. Now, in my research in doing my screenplay, Fourth and Going Home, I came across this book that was published in 2022 by Alan Murakami. It's called Peter Masuoka, The Uncle I Never Knew. Now, Peter's uncle, or Alan's uncle, Alan was born, I think, in 1965. So he never knew his uncle. It was 20 years after the war ended. But his mother, Peter's baby sister, she was in Amache at the time that her uncle was, and she eventually met her husband there. Her future husband was in Amache. But every Memorial Day, she would take Alan to the cemetery, the National Cemetery in San Bruno, to visit his grave. Staff Sergeant Peter Masuoka was killed in action in France on November 3rd, 1944. He was with the famed 442. He received the Silver Star for his bravery and is buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. So during the pandemic, Alan, who's a school counselor, decided to research his uncle, talk to his mother and other family members, his fiancée, who never married because she was so in love with Peter. He talked to her, talked to family, and he put together a nice story of who Peter was. And Peter was a great athlete. He played football. He played for Santa Rosa Community College. And when he went to Amache, he started out as a coach and head of youth sports at Amache High School until he had a chance to join the military. When they finally let him join the military, he joined, and of course, he was with the 442. So after Pearl Harbor, he and his brother Frank decided they wanted to enlist in the Army, but they weren't allowed to, even though they had two other brothers who are already in the military. So in 1943, January 1st, 1943, both Frank and Peter joined the 442, which meant that there were four Masuoka brothers in the Army, while their parents and their little sister, and certainly Peter's fiance, were in a prison in Colorado. And Peter eventually gave his life for his country. So it's kind of like Saving Private Ryan. You had four brothers that were in the military, except in the case of the Masuoka family, their parents were in a prison in the United States, and yet they were there risking their lives for their country. And this is the memorial at the Amache site, which I was glad I was able to visit. Beautiful site. You can tell it's really cared for. Now that it's a historic site, the National Forest people are there taking care of it. Nice little garden and trees. And this beautiful memorial to the 31 Amache residents who were killed in action during World War II, including Peter Masuoka, whose name is on the memorial, as you can see. Now, another story that came out of my researching this book on the football game, or researching the screenplay on the football game, is Chris Ishii. Chris Ishii was a Disney animator. He had been involved in creating cells for Fantasia and Dumbo. He was a young man, 21, 22, when he worked for Disney. But when Pearl Harbor occurred, he had to quit his dream job and he was sent to Amache. And he was still interested in art. He became the art director for the Pioneer newspaper that they had at Amache, the Amache Pioneer. And he decided to create an original cartoon called Little Nebo, which is about the life of an orphan Nisei boy in a Japanese-American internment camp. Chris is the gentleman sitting at the art table, drawing a picture of Little Nebo. And so it was very popular in Amache. People loved it. But in January 1943, when Chris was able to join the military, he did join as a translator, and they sent him to the Burma theater. He was in military intelligence service, and he fought with the famed Merrill's Marauders in the Burma theater, which fought behind enemy lines. They needed a translator because they would capture Japanese soldiers, and he would be able to translate. Very hazardous work. Remarkably, he survived the war. He met a Chinese woman when he was overseas. He married her, and then he went back to New York and created his own animation company. In fact, he did a TV pilot in 1972 for Mad Magazine special. It was never picked up. It's beautiful. You can see it on YouTube. You can watch the whole show. Beautifully done. But they couldn't get advertisers for it because they make fun of advertisers. That's what Mad Magazine did. One of the segments is making fun of the auto industry in the United States. So it didn't go over very well. Plus, the network thought it was too adult themed. But you can watch the entire thing. It's 30 minutes. It's very good. But he was able to continue his career as an animator and raise a family. And this is a Little Nebo cartoon. This is an example of the Little Nebo cartoon. And it's fitting that it deals with football. He reads that the Granada is putting together, Amache's putting together a football team. He gets all excited. He goes through his old case, and he gets out his old football uniform. And of course, they need him as a water boy. Now, every issue of the Granada Pioneer newspaper is in the Densho Digital Repository, which is a great site for information on Japanese and Japanese American history. Densho in Japanese means to pass on to the next generation. What a wonderful word. One word means to pass on to the next generation. I wish there was an English word that also meant the same thing. But it's a great site. Not only do they have the newspapers, but they have interviews with former residents of internment camps. I went through the entire Pioneer newspaper, went through issues before the football game, after the football game, read all the Little Nebo cartoons, and it was a wealth of information for me to write my screenplay. The paper was published almost the entire time the camp was open, from October 1942 to September 1945. Wonderful wealth of information. You can read day-by-day history of what was going on. And thanks to the Densho Digital Archives, which are an organization out of Seattle, Washington, you can get this information online. Now, this is a photo of the all-Japanese American 442 combat unit. Their slogan was "Go for Broke." And there were 400 Amache residents who were part of the 442. Of course, 31 were killed in action. But it's the most decorated combat unit in American history based on the size of the unit. They had 18,000 soldiers to start, and they literally lost 60% of them. 10,000 were either killed or wounded during the war. Now, the most famous battle that they're noted for was they were honored for rescuing the Texas base 141 infantry in France. The infantry were Texas guardsmen, so that's why they were all from Texas. And they kept sending American units to save them, and no one could do it. They were behind German lines. It was almost impossible. And finally, they asked the 442 to save them, and they did. And in the process, they literally gave their lives. There were 200 men that they saved, and 150 of the 442 died in the process of saving them. 700 were wounded in the effort. So again, they wanted to prove they were loyal Americans. They were hoping that if they could do that, that they would close down the camps in the United States. And eventually that did happen. The camp started closing. The end of 1944, Amache started letting people go back to California if they wanted to. but this Texas infantry unit was known as the Lost Battalion. And in 1962, Texas Governor John Connally invited the 442 to Texas and decreed that they were honorary Texans. And this is the head of the 442. He was a West Point graduate. He was Caucasian. His name was Colonel Virgil Rasmus Miller. They had a few Japanese American officers, but most of the officers were Caucasian. When he took over the 442, he didn't know what he was getting into. He's fresh out of West Point. And then when he saw them perform in battle, he knew they were a very special group of men. And he fell in love with this men. He really, really did realize that they would do anything he would ask. And he asked them to do some impossible tasks, like saving the Texas unit, which they were able to do. And so at one point, his general wanted to parade the 442 as well as other units that were under his command in front of the French. And so he paraded the 442. And the general got mad at Colonel Miller. He said, "Where are all your men? None of them are here. What's going on? I told you to parade everyone, even the cooks, everyone else who's in the unit. I wanted them to march." And he said, "I paraded everyone I have." He says, "That's all I have." And he started to cry. And, like I said, he loved his men. And, 60% of them were gone by the end of the war. And this story is retold by Rudy Takawa with the 442 about what happened with the colonel. And here is Rudy. I'll go ahead and run the video.
36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review. And like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters. And they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, "When I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review." And Chaplain Yamada said, "This is the first time I saw the colonel cry." And he said, "This is all I have left." Can you imagine the feeling he must have had to think that he had to order people to go out and get killed when it was these people that put the families into concentration camp and they're still there?
So a very powerful story. This is where I've got that interview. It's the Japanese American Museum. It's in Japanese American National Museum. It's in Los Angeles, California. And they provided me with a lot of footage. They said, you can use it in your program, just credit them. So I want to credit all the video footage that you can see is from the Japanese American National Museum. At the time, it was being refurbished. I think it's open again, but it's well worth visiting the museum in LA if you have a chance. And so now I'm going to show you some home movies that were shot at Amache. Just as first scenes, they're home movies. They're shot in 8mm color film. Most of it's in color film, beautifully shot. And it shows you what life was like at Amache. This first footage is of the Amache camp. Probably when it first opened. You can see there's not a lot of landscaping done yet, but it's mostly families enjoying themselves, socializing, the kids playing sports. And it was a very active camp. They didn't want to be there, but they enjoyed the time they had. They made the best of it, and they made friends and lifelong relationships. Marriages came out of being at Amache, but they were delighted when it was closed finally, and when they were able to go back to California. But you can see the flowers that were planted there, that they made this a very a friendly environment as much as they could. Of course, sports were played by the kids all the time. They were very active in sports. And here's a little playground that they put together. So they did look at this as a place that they wanted to make it livable for their children. And they grew trees and put in a couple playgrounds where they could. Now, this is kind of unusual for most of the residents that came from California. They had not seen snow on the West Coast in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles. And so this was very unique, and the kids and even the adults enjoyed the experience of seeing snow for the first time. And like most Colorado snowstorms, the sun would come out the next day. And you can see this is a warm snowstorm. They're still dressed in skirts. Not many of them are wearing coats. Now, the regular 8mm home movie format came out in 1933, so it was pretty commonplace by the time they moved to Amache. And its color film, vivid color film, was the 8mm format. Now, that was the Arkansas River that you just saw. They were allowed to go outside the camp. The Arkansas River was the source of all their water. And for farming in that area off of the Highway 24, the Arkansas was the source for all the successful farming. But you can see the flowers that were growing. They wanted to make it a livable place, a pretty place as much as possible. You can see this is later in the history of the camp. The trees are fairly mature. But you can see the children are very adaptable. Of course, all children are adaptable, and as long as they're with their families in a safe environment, they could make it a happy place. And here are a couple soldiers probably coming back from basic training and then maybe heading out to join the 442 after this. But they represented most of the residents of Amache. They were very proud to be American. They supported the war, and they gave their lives for their country. 31 Amache soldiers died in World War II. This next segment, again, it's courtesy of the National Japanese American Museum, is of a football game that actually took place at Amache. It's not the November 11th Armistice Day game, 1943. This is probably an intramural game, but you can see the amount of people that are there residents of Amache that are watching the game. And it takes place in front of the high school. You'll see the high school buildings there. But they have full uniforms. I don't know where they got them. Probably from local colleges that had stopped their programs. They may have purchased them. But very popular as a spectator sport. You can see everybody hanging from the poles there to watch the game. They had no grandstands at this point. But they love the sport of football. You can see the water tower in the background. That's still there at Amache. That tower has been preserved. And the high school was very nice. It was a new high school. As you can see, a beautiful new high school with a new gym. In fact, the students at the other local high schools were a little jealous because they had old high schools. But the Amache residents were in a prison camp, so there's a big difference. But they built a beautiful high school. All the teachers, practically all the teachers, were Amache residents as well. And certainly the sports programs. And you can see, I think a lot of people enjoyed working on the farm because it meant they could get out of the Amache residence there, where they were behind barbed wire and guard towers, and they could enjoy life a little bit more with some more freedom. But most of these Japanese Americans were farmers. They'd been farmers their whole lives. So it's not surprising they were very successful in growing vegetables, raising chickens and pigs and cattle at Amache. And if you ever done any farm work, and my grandfather did it his whole life, my grandmother as well, it's hard work. You're bent over most of the time. It takes a lot of effort to be successful. But the key to successful farming in Amache was not only their ability to farm, but also the source of water, the Arkansas River. Water is not a problem living by the Arkansas River. Now it turns to color footage of beautiful green peas. I think it's either string beans, beans or peas. I'm not quite sure what it is. Again, they were so productive in their farming efforts that they sold their extra vegetables to local stores, and then they also sold some to the the Heart Mountain Internment Camp in Wyoming. And you can see cattle there. Now this last segment is of a 4th of July parade inside Amache. You can see the Boy Scouts who are marching there. And it's really an interesting cultural mix. It combines the American 4th of July with Japanese culture, which is very unusual. And it's inside Amache. They're celebrating the freedoms of the United States. in the Constitution inside a prison camp. And you can see their loyalty to the United States, how much they loved being in America, and despite the fact that they were put in a prison. And you can see you have the traditional samurai. And here's a samurai soldier. It looks like everybody's there, all the children, all the families. Now, this last event is kind of interesting. You can see the kids running. They have donuts tied to a string, and they're bobbing for those donuts. Now, I'm 71, and my athletic ability is diminished, but I think I could compete in this type of competition and do pretty well. But I love seeing the kids, I love seeing the families, and they're celebrating the 4th of July. So this final story is another story I discovered while researching Amache. And it's a fascinating story, almost a humorous story. But of the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, there was not one case of treason, not one case of someone defying the United States or plotting to overthrow the United States. But there were 3 cases of conspiracy to commit treason, and I'm going to talk about that and the Shitara sisters. This is just the story of the Shitara sisters is also on the Densho website as well. But it's interesting because I didn't know this, but during World War II, there were 4,000 German POWs in the United States, including 20,000 in Colorado. There were 12,000 at Camp Carson in Colorado Springs, which is the Army base. There were 3,000 in Trinidad, Colorado, which is south of Pueblo, a small town. The town really promoted the idea of having this camp built there because the Depression had hit it really bad. And they wanted to have the POW camp there because they knew it would bring 1,000 American soldiers who would buy goods and services in the city of Trinidad. Also, it would provide them jobs for the construction of the camp, which it did. And for the local farmers, it would provide them with free labor to pick their vegetables. So they used their politicians to lobby for it, and they got the site approved. And they were just delighted. They called it the Fritz Ritz because they were so appreciative of them being there. And the Germans were also appreciative because they were no longer on the front lines of the war. They weren't freezing to death in Russia. They weren't boiling to death in North Africa. So for them, the war was over for them. So most of them were happy. Out of the 400,000 POWs, there were only 2,000 escapes. Most of them were recaptured. I think there were 12 that didn't come back until later in the war. They basically didn't make it back to Germany. They were hiding in plain sight in the United States, and they said they were Swedish and other nationalities. They had married American women, and one by one, they eventually surrendered and said, no, I was a German POW during the war. And for the most part, the United States said, we'll give you an opportunity to become a citizen if you want. But it's all recounted in this book called The Fritz Ritz, German POWs in World War II America by Claudia Hagen, who I contacted with by email. She was wonderful. She'd written the book during the pandemic as well. And she tells as a chapter on just Camp Trinidad and the Shitara sisters. And Camp Trinidad was unique because they did have a tunnel. They had a 600-foot tunnel that they could leave the prison But they didn't use it for mass escape. They didn't want to leave. But what they did is they used it to hook up with their American girlfriends. Because of the war, there was lack of men for romance for the local girls in Trinidad, lack of young men. So many of them hooked up with some of the prisoners in the Fritz Ritz. And so they would sneak out at night after the count, hook up with their girlfriends, and then come back before morning count. And the guards kind of looked the other way. They didn't care. But they were treated very well. The farmers gave them food. They were so well fed. And of course, they had the German bakers there. They ate very well. They ate better than any American almost, and any German citizen, I'm sure, during the war. So it was a very comfortable place to live. However, there were two prisoners that decided they wanted to escape. And what happened was there were three Japanese American women that were in the prison at Amache who were on agricultural leave. They let them leave. They had their own car, and they would go from farm to farm picking vegetables, making a little extra money and helping out the farmers in the process. But they were picking side by side with these German POWs, and a romance started. And these pictures were published in the Denver Post. Heinrich and Billy had a romance, the two Shitara sisters, Herman and Toots. Her real name is Tsuruko. And what happened was these soldiers said, we want to escape, we want to leave, because they had heard from newer soldiers coming in that how bad it was for the German citizens, and their family was back in Germany. And they didn't like Hitler. They were soldiers in General Rommel's Africa Corps when they were captured in early in the war. 125,000 Germans surrendered in Tunisia. Half of them went to the United States. The reason why the United States had a deal with the other allies that they would take half of the prisoners, and so they put them on troop ships back to the United States. They put them on trains, and then put them in different camps across the country, and used them for manual labor, agriculture, digging ditches, building roads. So these two men were picking vegetables, onions, in Trinidad when they met these two sisters, and they had an affair with them, and they asked them to help them escape. And so the sisters did. They had a car, and they gave them money for travel. They also bought civilian clothes for them, and they drove them to Santa Fe to take the train. They wanted to take the train to Mexico. Once they were in Mexico, maybe take a steamship to Spain and get back to Germany. But not to fight the Americans. They wanted to, this is what they said, I don't know if it was true or not, but they said they wanted to fight Hitler. And there's some truth to that fact, because their General Rommel, who was head of the Africa Corps, he famously was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And they gave him the choice to commit suicide and remain a hero, or be court-martialed and be sent to death. And he took the choice of committing suicide. So these men wanted to get back to Germany, supposedly to fight Hitler and support General Rommel. And the car broke down on the way to Santa Fe. And so the women couldn't do anything. The water pump went out. They had to get it fixed. And the men had already escaped from their camp, so they couldn't turn back. So they hitchhiked to Santa Fe. And when they got to the train station, word had got out that they were missing. And the FBI picked them up and sent them to prison. When they confiscated their suitcases, they looked through it, and they found these photographs. And they said, oh, it's obvious that they had help to escape. And these women, these Japanese American women, helped them. But we don't know who they are. We know they're probably in Amache. So they put this pictures on the front page of the Denver Post, and eventually someone identified them, and they arrested them. And they were sent to prison, a federal prison in Denver. And they were prosecuted for treason, which was punishable by death. They would have gone to the electric chair like the Rosenbergs did after World War II. For supposedly selling out the nuclear atomic bomb. But their other choice was conspiracy to commit treason. They prosecuted them for that, which was 2 years in a federal prison. Fortunately, they were just convicted of conspiracy to commit treason. So all three of the sisters, even though two of them had a romantic involvement with the prisoners, the third sister, was sent, Flo, as her name, was sent to a federal prison. They served 2 years. I could not get any information on what happened after they got out. I think they went back to California and kind of went back into obscurity. But the trial was quite the thing. It was, this is before television. And nothing so salacious and scandalous as Japanese American women having an affair with German POWs, that the courtroom was packed with 400 people at the trial. But anyway, this is the entrance to the Fritz Ritz, the Trinidad POW camp. You can't see the buildings from this side, but this is the camp. It looks like any prisoner of war camp. But it was nice. You could see the guard tower in the back, but they were very well treated. They loved it there. The aristocratic prisoners, German officers who loved horseback riding, purchased horses in Trinidad, and they were allowed to ride their horses outside of the camp. They would ride to the foothills. Obviously they came back. They had nowhere else to go, but they were treated very well. And this is typically how they used them on road crews to dig roads and ditches, and also to farm the local onion farms and potato farms. And so I wrote another screenplay because it's such a great story, although I had to create the characters, the personalities of the women from scratch. But I call it The Not So Great Escape, which occurred on October 17th, 1943. And these are the three Shitara sisters. There's Flo. Flo did not have an affair with any of the prisoners. They're all married. They all were married, and their men were in the army at the time. But they're all residents of Camp Amache. When they had the trial, like I said, there were 400 local residents at the trial, and they were waiting for the women to talk about this affair, but they never took the stand, except the two prisoners took the stand in their defense. They said, no, these women weren't trying to fight the United States. They just fell in love with us, and they were trying to help us get back to Germany so we could fight Hitler. But despite that, they were prosecuted for conspiracy to commit treason, which was the lesser offense, and they spent 2 years in a federal prison out east. And here are the three women from left to right. There's Flo, there's Billy, and there's Toots, whose real name is Terceruco. And you'll see in the caption there, guilty of conspiracy to commit treason, these three Japanese-American sisters, left to right, Mrs. Florence Flo Chavez Otani, Mrs. Billy Shitara Taganashi, and Mrs. Terceruco Toots Wallace. Of course, she had a Caucasian name, Wallace. Look completely unconcerned today at the federal court in Denver, where they were found guilty of charge of conspiracy in the escape of 2 German prisoners and faced prison terms of 2 years or a fine of $10,000 or both, and they had a 2-year prison sentence. But the reason why they look unconcerned, and I would be too, because they weren't prosecuted for treason. They were saved from the electric chair. So I think they're a little bit happy that it was only conspiracy to commit treason, because they knew that they could resume their lives after 2 years. And again, this photo went around the country, but was first published in the Denver Post of them in romantic embraces with these 2 German POWs. And that's what eventually got them in trouble. And there they are traveling to the courthouse. But what a great story, completely hidden in history. Now, the people of Amache did not like them at all, because their sons were there in 442. They were trying to prove they were loyal Americans, and this was an embarrassment to have 3 Japanese American women be arrested for conspiracy to commit treason. But they survived, and they went back to their regular life. And for the most part, like I said, 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camp, not one case of treason. And also, in terms of the Germans that were in the prison, there was not one case of sabotage. You had 400,000 Germans in the United States that they could have planned an escape, blew up a bridge or blew up a dam or something, but none of them did that. Like I said, there were 2,000 escapes, and most of them were captured immediately, but there were 12 that weren't captured after the war. And they pretty much were hiding in plain sight. They had married American women, they had children, they had businesses. One by one, they gave themselves up. The last one to give themselves up, it's kind of like the Japanese soldiers in the islands that were hiding for 20, 25 years after the war, and then they finally gave themselves up. Last German POW gave himself up in 1982. And I think the United States at that point said, apply for citizenship, we'll give it to you. You've been a good citizen. You have your own business, you have a family. You've earned the right to live here. I just want to end this program talking about this book about Nellie Nakamura, the neighbors of the Calvo family, my mother's family in Mountain View, California, who ended up being interned at the Heart Mountain Internment Camp and losing the life of their son, Kenny Nakamura, when he was 12 years old. The book is excellent. You can find it online. Again, she lived to be 107 years old, had quite the life, and she does retell the story of being at Heart Mountain. This is their home in Mountain View, California. This was taken before they were sent to Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And this is the house that my grandfather kept for them. They both shared land. They were sharecroppers. The Nakamura family raised raspberries, and my grandfather grew tomatoes and string beans. They didn't own the land, but my grandfather was there on the land during the war, and he made sure to preserve their home. So when they did come back after the war, they moved in for a short time in this home that I think Mr. Nakamura built. But Kenny is the youngest boy there in this scene. And they're very close to my mother's family, the Calvo family. In fact, Kenny was best friends of my Uncle Gene, who's in this picture there in the center. And what happened was when they went to Heart Mountain, because of lack of great medical care and the lack of clean facilities at Heart Mountain, he contracted meningitis and died rather quickly. Now, there's an interesting story that my grandmother tells, and it's related to my Uncle Victor, who was a pilot, a B-24 pilot in World War II. It's interesting. He joined when he was 19 years old. He was valedictorian of his school, very bright, tested well. He was 19. He joined the Army Air Corps, and he wanted to be a pilot. And the training literally took a year and a half before they sent him to Italy as a B-24 co-pilot, and he was 20 years old at the time. He turned 21 in January. He flew 30 missions right up until the end of the war. He was also escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black African-American red-tail fighter pilots, and he has written letters to his mother almost weekly from February of 1943 when he joined the Army Air Corps until he came back in 1945. And we have this great collection of letters, and he does talk about being escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen and how wonderful they were in protecting the B-24s. But while he was in training, my grandmother, got a telegram. Now, this is a woman who's never had a telegram in her life. So she knows her son is training to be a pilot and how dangerous it is. And so when she gets the telegram, she automatically assumes it's the worst, that her son has been killed in training. And, when she was crying, she opened the telegram and she read that it was from Mrs. Nakamura telling her that her son, Kenny, had died at Heart Mountain. She felt it was important to inform my grandmother and the family because Kenny was close to everybody. And my grandmother always felt guilty about this, but when she read that it wasn't her son dying, she felt relieved. It was still an awful thing to learn, but for her, it wasn't Victor dying in the war. But anyway, the book is excellent, and it does tell the story of my grandfather saving their house and the relationship with the Calvo family. And also, you can get my book on Amazon for $19.99. There's no such thing as a typical librarian. And thank you for taking the time to view this program.